today. We appreciate being here and partnering with the Maryland Natural History Society. We love working with folks and partnering anything conservation we can do. Wildlife needs a lot of help. So we love being able to collaborate and talk about these things that we really love. Um, so today we want to focus on this species that has become really near and dear to our heart, not only as residents of Maryland, they're very iconic species for our state as our state insect, which we'll talk about, but also with the work we're doing with them at our wildlife center. So this is a species that is so close to home that it's actually something we're working at in our own backyard at our wildlife center. So once again, I'm Scott McDaniel. I'm the executive director of the Susquehannock Wildlife Society. And Madison, I'll let you introduce yourself. But I am the only employee now at our wildlife center, and working with a great team of volunteers and our board of directors to do all these wonderful things. We're a 501c3 nonprofit and founded in 2011. And our mission is focused on the lower Susquehanna River basin and the surrounding areas. So we're kind of carved out this area because we felt like it had a lot of really interesting biodiversity, and it also had a lot of wildlife that really needed more attention, things in people's backyards they didn't realize existed, and a lot of attention on the Chesapeake Bay, which we love. But the bay and its major tributary, the Susquehanna River, often gets left out of the conversation, and a lot of the headwaters and streams and forests that lead into that great river at the top of the bay, we felt needed some more advocacy. So that's why we founded this organization, as well as to cover some of the things that we feel are not always captured, which is rescue. So when people have wildlife in need, they can call someone. As well as being able to do hands-on research that contributes to the scientific body of knowledge, and then doing, of course, outreach and education that all kind of come together for conservation. Madison, do you want to tell them a little bit about yourself and your role in the organization? And I'll go on to the next.
Sure. So I'm relatively new, actually. I've been with the organization for this is going on, I think, my third year with Susquehannock. I started with my when I was with Towson University as part of the Honors College. I was in need of an alternate research project to fulfill the requirements of the Honors College, and my career goal is to be an entomologist, so to study insects. And I contacted Scott through a mutual friend, John Garrison, who's actually here, and just kind of asked if there was anything that his organization, Susquehannock, had working, or anything that could be an opportunity for me. And we started with something that was sort of vague and, hey, can we work with the Baltimore Checkerspots and work with them to try and see what we could do. We have all of this white turtlehead, which we'll talk about later, and we've been doing a lot of work to try and rehabilitate them on our property. Would you like to get involved with that? And I said, of course. And from there, it's just kind of blossomed into what it is now. And we'll get into more detail as we go. So,
cool. Thank you so much. So as I mentioned, one of our pillars is research. So mostly focused on herps, so reptiles and amphibians, because so there's some of the species that need the most help, but we've started branching out more into insects and other species. We do surveys for mammals using trail cameras, and obviously we do a lot of advocacy around birds and native plants as well, that all kind of connect together. But that's one of our pillars. So some of the species that we work with, rare turtles and salamanders, and then copperheads even. We do a lot with education, so outreach, talking to people about wildlife and how they can look out for them, what they can do to help, sort of thing, leaving wildlife in the wild, and all those sorts of things are really important to us. Um, Rescue, as I mentioned earlier, so if someone has a need for an animal that is injured, they might call us, especially if it's in Harford County area or Cecil. We try to respond the best we can and get those animals to the medical care that they need through our rehabilitation and veterinarian partners. Conservation, that's where we try to find species that are maybe rare, declining, misunderstood, and advocate for them. And these are ones that are maybe common other places, but maybe declining or not commonly seen in our area. So we do a lot of advocacy around that. You can see the Baltimore Checkerspot has a nice carve out in pretty much everything we do. And all this kind of comes together with the Susquehannock Wildlife Center. So this is just, we are a regional organization, so we cover a lot of ground that we didn't want to be an organization that was only focused on our 20-acre property, but we did want to have a place where we could do research, where we could do habitat restoration, where we could do education and bring people out to see all these things with local wildlife that they could do at their own homes, places of worship, schools, businesses, as well as just see these animals up close and get to know them so that they care about them enough to want to protect them. So it's a little just background on the property. We are working to open the Wildlife Center this summer. We're as close as we've ever been. So we are taking this 20-acre former farm, put in a lot of really cool elements to try to connect people with local wildlife. Created a vernal pool and artificial snake dens. We have an 8.5-acre meadow we're really proud of. We're hoping to burn the meadow this spring to rejuvenate that part of the landscape. But we have an incredible amount of pollinators that use this meadow, and meadows are one of our rare habitats in our region right now that we're really trying to advocate for as an alternative to only planting trees, having that diversity of habitat that supports a lot of birds and insect species in particular, as well as native food forests like pawpaws and persimmons that are good for wildlife and also good for humans. They're really delicious. So we're going to get into now the Baltimore Checkerspot Butterfly, the main event that you all came here for. I personally had saw the need for us to get involved with this species, not only because it was our state insect, but because when we first were looking at the property where we have the Wildlife Center, one of the first things we noticed was there was a naturally occurring population of white turtlehead, so their host plant. And at that time, we had not seen any Baltimore Checkerspot butterflies, but we knew there was some confirmed nearby. So we knew that we had the ingredients that we would possibly need to have a population there. And then we started meeting with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and talking to them about what we could do to enhance the habitat and potentially encourage them to use the property. And at that time, there was a Checkerspot corridor team developed in Harford County, where we and other places around the state where we were meeting and discussing creating corridors for the species and doing all these restoration efforts at different nature centers and state parks around the state. That's since kind of disbanded because we did start learning a lot more about the species over time. That was going to make it a lot harder to bring back on a larger scale, and their threats turned out to be a lot more complicated than we originally thought. But because we had habitat, we decided to start enhancing it in different ways that we're going to talk about now. So a little background on the species is just becoming the Maryland State Insect in 1973, same year that the Endangered Species Act was created and signed. So as with the Baltimore Oriole, the Checkerspot has this pattern that's named after George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, which they always say his crest was orange and black, which I always feel like it's yellow and black. So I don't really, the colors don't match exactly, but that's kind of the same with the Oriole, but that's what their name signifies. So people think because it's called the Baltimore Oriole or the Baltimore Checkerspot, that means that this is where they were first described or discovered. So not so much the case. Doesn't mean that this is the place where they thrive, as we'll see with the checker spot. But they're named after this really unique pattern, which does help the species a great deal. So Madison, do you want to talk about the facts, kind of just a little background on the species here?
Sure. So they are a relatively small species, on average about 2.5 inches in wingspan. The males and the females, there's no sexual dimorphism, so that just means that you can't tell the males and the females apart. So other than maybe a slight difference in size, like the females might be slightly larger, but at first glance you wouldn't be able to tell. They're the main predators that we've seen or that research has indicated are parasitic wasps, which means that the main time when they're the most vulnerable to predation is when they're actually in the egg stage and when they're in the larval stage, either the first instar or the second instar. So like before their first molt, or when they're in the egg, when the parasitic wasp can actually get to them. They are distasteful, same as very, very similarly to the monarch or other species that have that very bright coloration, much in part due to their host plant, which is the white turtle head. They do feed on that, and it actually helps make them distasteful to birds. They do still get eaten by other predators like that, like praying mantis, that sort of thing. But it's not as common as it would be for species that don't have that benefit. The most important part, or the thing that makes them, I guess, a little bit more complicated, is that they don't migrate. So when we think about butterflies like this, we think about the monarch, or that travel great distances, or that can move great distances in order to find food sources or lay eggs in different locations. These guys don't do that. They stick to a very limited area in order to work out their entire lifespan, which is, when they're adults, it's only about 2 weeks. So that means, if that area is impacted by flooding, any major agricultural construction or anything like that, it could potentially wipe out an entire population of these guys. So that's part of why we have why it makes it a little bit more complicated. We will get into, I guess, a little bit more during their life cycle, but the caterpillars will overwinter in leaf litter during what's called a stage called diapause, which is very similar to like hibernation or torpor in other animal species. And so that's how they overwinter or ride out the cold weather. So here's some examples of the stages of their life cycle. On the top and the bottom left photos, these were actually our adult females from the first year of our translocation process. They were laying eggs on the property at Hopkins Branch. And as you can see, especially in the bottom left photo, they will attach themselves to the leaf of the white turtle head and use their abdomen to attach the eggs to the underside of the leaf. The bottom right corner shows the first newly laid eggs, which are actually a bright yellow color. Females will on average lay about 250 eggs. They lay multiple clutches. We had a few females that laid about 3 clutches, but it can range depending on any number of different things. The upper left is, as the eggs age, they will turn a very bright red color. So the closer they are to hatching, the brighter red they will get. The upper the upper right is right before hatching, and you can actually see some of the very first instar larvae that are emerging from the eggs. And then, as you can see, the bottom left and the bottom right are the first instar larvae, which are super, super tiny. They will emerge from those eggs and they will immediately start to rise and rise to the top of the white turtlehead plant that they are on, and immediately start feasting on the top of the plant to work their way down.
And I wanted to chime in and say, these look way bigger than they are.
Yeah,
These are really great
they're
close-up macros
small.
that Madison took, and these are absolutely tiny. I mean, in the leaf, you can't see the scales much, but I mean, the turtlehead leaves are maybe about as big as what, like 2 fingers or something. I mean, they're pretty narrow leaf plants. They're not like a large plant by any means. So to see these little tiny egg masses and these absolutely tiny little caterpillars, if you saw them, you know what they were, you would just think there's some sort of little worm, or you wouldn't even really pay attention to them. You wouldn't know that they're this really special butterfly species if you just came across them. Yeah.
I'm trying to. Thank you. Yeah, about the size of a mint leaf is a very good comparison. Maybe slightly larger, but not by much.
That's good. Yeah.
So as they age, they will go through one molt or 2 molts, and then they will start to web. They will form these webs on the plant that they were hatched upon. So they'll feed within the web, they'll move to different leaves, they'll web on those leaves, they'll feed on the leaves, and it helps to protect them from the elements, from predators, that sort of thing. And it also just allows them a safe space to molt within and stay together. As you can see on the one on the right, you'll see they start to get that black coloration. And as the plant gets older and the seasons start to change, the webbing will start to get a little bit thicker. They'll start to form what's called their diapause web. So it'll begin to form more of a thick web so that they can use that in order to partially, so part of them will stay within that web in order to hang out over the winter, and then some of them will actually go to leaf litter and hang out over the winter. The question in the chat was, does anything else eat turtlehead? In terms of insects, it doesn't have, I didn't notice anything that really fed on it as heavily as checker spots do. Deer was our main concern at the center, but insect wise, we didn't have too many that were, we didn't have to protect it from any pests or anything like that. Scott, do you know of anything off the top of your head?
Thank God no spotted lanternflies eating it at this point.
Yeah,
so,
for real, gosh.
Yeah, so that'd be another fun thing to deal with. No, and a lot of the beetles and other species seem to leave alone. I mean, from what I've seen, I'm sure there's been observations of things, other insects eating it to some degree. I don't know if it. I guess it does have some level of. I don't know if it has any sort of toxicity that is more specific to it.
Do you know is there any kind of fungus that attacks turtlehead? I ask because we tried to grow some in our yard and it kept dying back, and the leaves were kind of like it had been attacked by a fungus of some sort.
We actually, what was it, powdery mildew that we had the problem with here?
Yeah, we had
yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah, the mildew does grow on it, and it can be removed. Our nursery, Kohler Nursery, gave us something to put on some of them. Some of them seemed like they'd have it. It didn't really affect it. It was just kind of more unsightly. It was like a real white, kind of powdery. If you just had like a lot of dieback, I mean, they are a more of a wetland plant. So if they're in full sun and they don't have wet enough soil, the soil is very dry.
Yeah, well, we chose it
off.
because it was like a super swampy part of the yard.
Okay. Yeah,
where nothing else would grow because it was too wet.
Okay.
I remain hopeful it will still, get established. But
the first year sometimes we noticed that some struggle a little bit, and then the next year you'll have more robust plants. I mean, we've planted hundreds of turtlehead plants on our property in all different parts of the landscape, some wetter, some drier. And we've had pretty good success, I'd say. I mean, we've had some pretty strong plants. Some years though, some just die off, like we just have less plants, and some of the spots where there was a lot of plants have just died back, even though they're caged.
Yeah.
So it's very hit or miss.
Yeah. There was another question in the chat. And again, unfortunately, we might not get to all of these as they come up. I apologize. I'll try to get to as many as I can.
Some of these we do cover later on the talk.
Yeah,
so.
some of them we will come up. So if you don't see us or you don't hear us answering these, just know that we do see them. But they do feed on other host plants. That is true. And I will talk about that later on. How many host plants are needed to host the caterpillars? That does vary depending on how many clutches are laid on a single plant, how many eggs, sometimes the clutches are larger than others. We had one female that laid a very small clutch versus another female that laid very large clutches. It also depends on the size of the plant itself. We had turtle head plants that, on average, we had some that could get up to about 4 feet tall. We had some that were, smaller than that, but it's also about leaf, like, how many leaves on the plant, because they don't feed on the stem. It's just the leaf part. So there's a couple of different variables there.
I would like interject to
Yeah.
just for butterflies in general, in my opinion, just even from doing like swamp milkweed for monarchs and other things, is if you're actually trying to plant, and we'll tell you why we don't necessarily recommend you planting turtle head for checker spots.
Yeah.
You can plant it because it's a great native plant. It's beautiful. It's something that's really nice to have in a garden in a backyard. But the chance of attracting checker spots is very unlikely for a variety of reasons that we'll get into. But before we're done here, but when I plant things, I always at least get 3 plants if I have any intent of things using them. I was lucky and unlucky at my house. I got a new house February last year, and I did a little pollinator garden just to start off. And I bought a few plants, a few swamp milkweeds, thinking, okay, maybe I'll have a couple monarchs show up. I ended up having 50 caterpillars, that eggs get laid by monarchs. And so I ended up buying more plants to supplement because they were stripping them pretty much completely bare. So, what you don't want to do is create an ecological trap where you're attracting things and you don't have enough plants, and then they just starve to death and they have nowhere to go. And then, of course, having a variety of plants and things for nectars for the adults, but then also, things that they can attach their chrysalis to. So you want variety of structures. So not just having, I've had people just buy like a turtle head plant, they plant it and go, okay, I'm going to get checker spots now. Well, if they did happen to show up, you'd just starve them to death and you just attracted them there. So I also say, what if one plant dies? What if one gets knocked over in a storm? So you always want to have 3 or 4 of any plant, in my opinion, just to have that resiliency. And then, of course, if you had a bunch of checker spots showing up, you'd want a lot more plants. We have probably, what was our count? It was like 200 plus plants.
It was a
The
lot.
last
Yeah.
count. It was naturally occurring, and then we added a lot. We supplemented a lot of plants around the property so that we had a robust number of plants across our landscape. But we had, maybe 50 or 100 naturally occurring plants that we kind of enhanced and kind of protected over time, and then we added a lot more to that. So
and it varies again. It varies again from year to year. So we will, even if you plant turtle head and it does very well one year, the next year it might return and not be as robust as it was the year before. So,
and it will grow in drier, like in a flower bed, if it's not really dry and really hot all the time. I experiment a little bit in my yard, knowing that it was not a wet spot. I do have a little bit of a rain garden I created, but some of it did okay and some of it just dried out. It just was not wet enough for it. It seems like in nature, I think there was some analysis done on it. I mean, the plants that did the best, there was some sort of wet soil within a foot or 2 below the surface. They will grow in more like marginal wetland areas. They're not going to grow in the water like an iris, or like a arrow rum, or like one of those other kind of bog plants that you might see necessarily. They seem to be more on the edges. They do the best on the edge of these wetlands where they have enough substrate to grab onto, but they stay fairly wet. Like I've noticed swamp milkweed, for instance, if it's inundated with water, they tend to die off. But if they're kind of on the edges where it stays moist but not completely saturated, they'll do better. So it's a little bit of experimentation. Some of the cultivated plants, as long as it's still a white turtle head, they may be a little more robust than just doing seed. Like some of them are grown to be a little stronger, have a little stronger root masses if you get them in a pot already. You're not just starting off with seeds or little tiny plugs. Sometimes that helps. It just depends. So like I said, you kind of experiment. But if you have a little bit semi-shaded, a little bit moist, a little wet spot that gets pretty wet during a rain, it's gonna do a lot better. And it's pretty resilient. We've had them survive floods, just completely knocked everything down, and then had the turtle head just laying on its side, still growing and blooming and everything. And they're a pretty strong plant. That's how they do well in these wetland systems that get flooded out occasionally.
They do also have I believe, a lateral root structure. So that's kind of a double-edged sword, where it makes it very strong once it is established, and it causes those large, sometimes large patches to occur. But at the same time, it does kind of take a little bit of time to establish that. So you might not get a large patch if the conditions aren't kept up for an extended period and consistent. So they need to be planted. The seeds need to be sown, I think, in the fall, so that it can develop more of that lateral root structure during that time period, so that it can start to show up during the spring and the early summer.
You want to talk about this next instar and the
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Okay.
So moving on back to the life cycle. So the two caterpillar pictures that are on this slide are of the later instars, so the later versions of the larva right before it begins to form chrysalis. So it's going to be the largest version and the most voracious version of the caterpillar. And even though it looks like some other species where it's going to, really cause some irritation if you touch it, those little spines and that bright orange coloration, these actually don't, they don't have those urticating hairs. They're not really going to mess with your skin if you touch them. I'm not advocating for anyone to go out and grab them, but they aren't going to be ones that are going to cause, any major skin irritation or anything. It's mostly to ward off predators. The chrysalis on this slide is they tend to stay in that for I would say probably about 3 weeks, Scott. That was what we were in.
It was 2 or 3. It was 2 or 3
weeks.
Yeah.
And these will stay that white color, and again adapt some of that orange and black spots kind of throughout the top of it and around the outside. And then right before they're about to hatch, or emerge, they will turn slightly darker color, as you would kind of expect from other species. But they will do this. We've noticed that they will, the pattern is usually around June to early July is when they will start to, around here is when they'll start to emerge from chrysalis.
Yeah. And one of the things I just love to note is that this is just such a beautiful species from start to finish. I mean, it really, every phase is really, the chrysalis is very unique, especially the later instar caterpillars are just really unique. So they're pretty easy to identify. There are some, there's another lookalike, I can't remember which one it was. There's another species that has a similar chrysalis that's had someone like in the middle of Baltimore City send me a picture and said, oh, this is a checker spot. And then we had to like kind of look at it from a few angles. It's another, maybe you remember, Madison, I don't remember what it was. It's like one of the little fritillaries or something.
Oh yeah,
but,
I mean they are very similar. Yeah,
looks very similar in that phase, but it wasn't. Once it emerged,
right.
you knew what it was. So.
Yeah.
So these are the adults, right?
These are the adults. Yep, these are the adults. So as you can see on the one that has its wings flat out. You will see some dots on there. And I wanted to just kind of bring this up. That's not naturally occurring marking. What we did for ours was we did mark them. And I think you have a slide later on about this too. So I'll go back into it more in detail, but that is gel pen. So don't misconstrue that for anything else. But so these are the adults. This was during the first year, I believe, when we took these photos.
Yeah.
And I'll go into it a little bit more detail, but we would essentially just mark them and then release them back into the wild on the property and allow them to continue to carry out the breeding process if they were going to do that. So as we mentioned before, they do have other host plants, but the main host plant is the white turtlehead, especially in Maryland. In fact, I think in Maryland, it is the vastly predominant host plant. The other host plants that are mentioned, they might be very, very secondary. We've only really seen them feed on white turtlehead. I've found research and we've discussed it with other colleagues that do research on the species, especially when they're more common in states like Massachusetts, where they have moved on to English plantain and other species like that away from the white turtlehead. But down here, it is definitely white turtlehead central.
Yeah, and like English plantain, you're going to see it in a lot of mowed lawns and things as well.
Yeah.
So, we did not observe any. That doesn't mean they wouldn't use it. All of ours, we try to keep them in the natural areas. We didn't release any into areas that had other species. Although everywhere we do plant white turtlehead, just as a kind of a standard we set for ourselves, we try to put an airwood viburnum in the same landscape, just because it's a secondary host plant. And well, and we don't want to say host plant because host plant says they're going to always going to lay their eggs on the white turtlehead. As far as I understand, and the early instars are only going to use that, but then they'll feed on.
I think they lay in Massachusetts.
Oh, they do. Okay, so
plantain as well. Yeah, okay. So that's why it's weird.
Oh, that is weird. Okay, yeah, I know they did observe some things at Tufts and some other places, but yeah, but I know some of what I've read is that when they'll move on to some of these alternatives as they're older. In those later stages, they're a little less picky than when they're really early on. But the host plant being so specific is definitely a detriment to them in that sense, in that they have to have this plant, at least around here, for their survival. It's definitely the anchor plant for their survival. Whereas some other species of butterflies might have 4 or 5 options of species that they could grab onto, so they're not. If one has a problem or has a disease or something else that wipes out that plant, they have an alternative to go to. So not so much here on that. But it's a really beautiful plant. I love seeing it. It's so unique too. And really the turtle head on it, the flower. There is another turtle head that you'll see often at nurseries, like a hot pink and all these crazy magenta plants. There is another native, I think it's the red turtlehead in Maryland. It's more of it's in Southern Maryland. It's a very rare. I think it's endangered in Maryland, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not exactly clear on that, but I know down when you get further south, there's another species as well. The white turtlehead is the primary one, and the ones that you all see the cultivars of that might be like a magenta red, bright pink, things like that, is not their host plant. It's been altered, and I'm not saying that they won't necessarily use it if given to them. But if you're trying to we're actually trying to plant a host plant for the species, you need the very specific variety of white turtlehead, at least here.
Right.
So this is one of the things that one of the biggest threats is really just grazing by deer, and that's obviously a big problem for our forest landscapes. The hot lips, white turtlehead. Yeah, I've seen that too. I've seen it at like the big box stores sometimes. So yeah, stay away from that. If you're trying to have something that's native, a native version, I'd stay away from those cultivars. Unless you just like them, then do what you like. But yeah, so the deer, you know, they kind of indiscriminately graze things, but I think they particularly like the flowers. So they've even been observed eating plants that are, you know, covered in caterpillars. So they mow them down almost to the ground. Makes, you know, at key points in the development of the species, if the plants get all mowed down. We definitely have seen, before we caged in our turtlehead little groupings, we did notice deer grazing. They would just chop off the plants about 6 inches from the ground. So that's a big problem. So, you know, our deer don't have natural predators essentially in this area anymore. So they tend to go into an area and they might feed there every single night. Whereas if there's areas that had wolves or cougars or other things, the deer would keep moving. They're less likely to just wipe out an entire area of plants, like they do here oftentimes, where they just kind of can hang out with impunity, other than our limited hunting seasons. So the other thing that the checker spot does seem to really favor these sunny open wetlands, not so much these little wetland areas that are in the forest, although sometimes you will see white turtlehead growing these little like spring seeps in the forested area. They really do a lot better in these open sunny wetlands where they can get lots of sun exposure for their caterpillars and for the adults, so for when they fly around. And at one time we had larger grazing animals, bison and elk, and natural fires that would keep these lowland areas open and sunny for the longevity of the species. So that's one of the big landscape changes that seems to have affected the species. You know, and for a time though, we also did have a lot more dairy farms and just grazing of cattle in a lot of these areas, which you know, kind of replaced the idea of having bison or elk or something else keeping these areas open. But a lot of these farms have since, you know, gone out of business, and we have less of these farms out there where you have these animals grazing and keeping these things open. So we're kind of left with a lot of these wetlands drying up, you know, becoming maple swamps. Maples tend to, even if it's a native tree like a red maple, they do a lot of damage to some of these wetlands by drying them out and creating a shade canopy over them. And then one of the things that's really important to the species, probably as critical as having the host plant, I'd say, I'd probably agree, Madison, is having a robust amount of nectar available for those adults. So yeah, they might only be alive as a butterfly stage for 2 weeks, but having a variety of especially native plants. They do tend to use other plants as long as they're flowering, but plants that are in bloom during their life cycle, which is a very actually more complicated thing than we originally expected when we got into this project. We just figured, okay, you know, there's all these plants. It's June by this time, so you figure there'd be lots of stuff in bloom because we have all of our early spring blooms, and then, you know, you go into the summer when you have all your iconic kind of wildflowers and milkweeds, black-eyed Susans, other things. But a lot of the species bloom later in the summer. Ironweed's the later one in the summer. A lot of the things we had on our property tend to lean towards the later end of the summer, not the beginning of summer. So when these checker spots are emerging, we're like looking around, we're like, there's not that many plants that are flowering right now. We did have milkweed and dogbane. It seemed like it kind of saved the day, and there's some mountain mint that provided some nice nectar source, but it was fairly limited. So that seems to be part of what might be going on with their decline too. Oh geez, mountain mint's already coming up. Yeah, I saw I saw Virginia bluebells were already popping up in Susquehannock, which is the earliest I've ever seen them because of all this warm weather. But it seems like the butterfly may be out of sync with some of our plant cycles here, at least in Maryland, as it tends to trend warmer. We're going to talk about that in a minute. We'll show you their range and kind of what's happening to them. That'll explain a little bit, answer your question. That's a good question. So we do have that meadow at our property though. So we've done a lot of work to try to enhance a large variety of wildflower. And that's one of the things when you asked about planting turtlehead earlier, I always say, yes, you can plant turtlehead, but also make sure you plant lots of other things that bloom at different times of the year, create a nice diversity of wildflowers for all your butterflies at their different life cycles. So you can you always want to, same thing, you want to catch monarchs at the end of the season, give them something to feed on as they're passing by, as they're migrating. So you want to have nectar sources for them later in the year when other things aren't in bloom, and that sort of thing. Okay, so perfect tee up for that. For the range map, I'll talk about this a little bit since I worked at DNR on some of this for a while. Some of these surveys we've done at some of these wetland sites. So you can see the top left map was kind of the historic colony range, and this is by no means incorporate all the sightings of checker spots over the decades, but you can kind of see what's happening, I believe, through the map in a lot of ways. And honestly, the map right below it is not even accurate either necessarily, because I think that is even outdated at this point. Because there was a population at Harford Glen that was an introduced population like ours, although we had a naturally occurring population within our little ecosystem that we're maintaining. The one there has no longer no longer viable. So there's already a lot of these little dots. If you look at them where they're at, they're almost all near the Pennsylvania border, besides a couple. There's one down in Montgomery County, but most of them either higher elevation to the west or near the PA border. If you look at the old map above, there were checker spot records down the Eastern Shore, down south of DC. So, we are seeing this retraction for moving north. And if you look at the range map of the species across the United States, there's some Midwest, kind of Ohio drainage, Mississippi Valley, but a lot of them, they're most prominent probably around the Great Lakes and in New England. And then you can see they kind of have this little finger that comes down along the Appalachian. So they tend to like that cooler climate zones, higher elevations, or further north seems to be where they're thriving. And that's going to make a lot more sense as time goes on, unfortunately. So one of the things that we're talking a lot about with the species right now, and this is work that was done by DNR, we do not do this, but some of the models are showing some fairly significant shifts in these climate zones. And these little dots represent some of the colonies of checker spots, and the ones that seem like they will persist further into the future. And we're looking at the same thing with species like wood turtles, completely unrelated species, but they are more of a new northeast species, New England species, into the Great Lakes, very much like the checker spot. And we are at the edge of their range. And as climate shifts, species that have a more northern population, and when you're at the southern ends of the range, are probably going to start blinking out. If they cannot handle that change, they are not as warm tolerant for whatever reason, whether it's an overwintering period, they need cold period for egg production or sperm production, or we're not exactly sure what the triggers might be yet. But you can see on this comparative map, at least the core areas. It doesn't mean there won't be little small populations that'll persist into the future. We're hoping ours will, and that's something we'll be experimenting for. But there's little, cold areas, little microclimates where they may persist. But it seems like, at least for now, some of these places where we find them may blink out, and our Western Maryland, Garrett County populations may be the only ones that are really suitable. So that's really depressing when you're talking about a Maryland state insect that may not be found really in Maryland much in the long term, 20 some years in the future, but that's something we'll be closely keeping an eye on. Madison, did you have anything to add to that, or does that cover it pretty well?
No, I think you mostly got it. I mean, I know they had been monitoring colonies in the Piedmont, and up until recently, they were, I guess a little bit more prominent than our area, but as of the last year or so, even they're starting to decline. So even the higher elevation areas are still starting to show hits. So in Maryland, so it's depressing. It's we're doing what we can. So
yeah. So there is a population northwest Harford County. So yeah, we are by no means only. There's several small populations in Harford County. That's actually One of the Norrisville populations is actually where we relocated some caterpillars from, as well as another site in Baltimore County. The DNR connected us with a landowner and gave us permission to do it. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But one thing that we did note, that there were some more southern populations that were or southern sites that were slated to do restorations, and they were kind of scrapped for that climate reason. So that's one of the reasons we are closely watching that, because it's not going to be worth, like, for instance, we've had folks contact us that maybe we're down in Anne Arundel County. Hey, I want to, do a checker spot restoration. And the recommendation from the state would probably be, it's not really worth trying to reintroduce them somewhere where there's a lower chance of them surviving, because the climate does seem to have a major impact on them. And if you're in a more southern area of the state where you're even further effects of the climate shift would be felt by the species, so it wouldn't be wise to start a restoration there. If they're already there and they're found, obviously they should be protected and any habitat enhanced and things like that. But yeah, if you live in Norrisville, so that you might be a good candidate, Diane, to if you put enough turtlehead in your backyard and there was a population nearby, that would be a situation where it may be worthwhile, because you actually have a population nearby, and that's something we're going to talk about in a minute here. So if you look at our restoration site, we do have these cool little signs around some of the area that we kind of keep off limits for them. Lots of turtlehead planted around the landscape, and this 8.5 acre meadow we mentioned earlier that has lots of wildflower diversity. There's an old pasture that we converted, hand seeded, and we've been maintaining, killing off invasives, trying to cut out woody plants whenever we can. So it's been a really worthwhile endeavor and something we've working really hard. And we did all this before we brought a single caterpillar in. So I wanted to note that we didn't just bring in caterpillars and let's see what's going to happen kind of thing. We put the work in ahead of time and made sure we had a robust number of plants, robust number of pollinator nectar sources. And that still doesn't guarantee anything, but it's something we don't take lightly when we're moving them from one place to another. We want to do everything we can to make sure they don't die off unnecessarily. So one of the things we mentioned earlier about the deer grazing, it's fairly low grade technology. It's just putting up fences. It doesn't take a whole lot. And obviously these aren't like what you would call official deer fencing, because deer can clear these if they want to, but they're small enough that if they're just walking around grazing, these fences have been just some basic wire with stakes, and we're going to kind of build these up to be a little bit more permanent as time goes on. But we wanted to attempt, experiment with them a little bit, and they were completely fine. We did not have any deer get into these enclosures at all, and it did keep the plants rather free from grazing. Now everything else grows in there, so our biggest problem is just other species kind of crowding out the turtlehead. That's been our biggest challenge. And then the wetlands shifting over time and inundating some of the enclosures, which happens as well. But you can see what we were doing in there with these turtlehead enclosures. So this is the translocation we talked about. And like I said, some are from Harford County and some are from Baltimore County. We did want to make sure the genetics were close to the region. There's not going to be any significant differences, but we didn't want to take caterpillars that were had genetics that were adapted to a higher elevation area or mountainous area of the state from Garrett County and then try to bring them here. So we kept them as close as possible to our site so that they had the best chance of survival. We moved 36 caterpillars, so it wasn't a whole lot. We left plenty there at the site so that we weren't impacting that population. But what we did note at the one site, which was somewhat alarming, it was supposedly a good site that we were moving these caterpillars from. And we went to several sites that DNR had noted the butterflies in the past and came up empty at multiple sites. And the habitat was still there, plants were still there at a lot of these sites, and they just weren't there. They definitely have crash years, like a lot of species. This past year is one of them. But what we noticed was one of the sites where we moved a lot of these caterpillars, there actually wasn't much turtlehead, whether it was from deer or what, we're not sure. But these caterpillars probably wouldn't have survived. They didn't have really any host plants to feed on. So the ones we took, we felt a little better about taking them because they were just kind of crawling all over skunk cabbage looking for plants to eat. And we only found a little bit of turtlehead at that site that year. So we're not really sure what's going on. We haven't been back since. We're going to hopefully check it out this year and see what's going on. Hopefully some more turtlehead bounce back there. But if deer are going through and grazing it all out, the caterpillars aren't going to be able to do very well there. You want to talk a little bit about this part, Madison?
Sure. So the main, obviously the main goal of the project is to try and build a sustainable population on the property. So the way that we intended to try and do that was we set up what are called dorms, which are those little white tents that you see in that picture over there where I am posing. So the way that those are is they're literally just they're actually bug traps or insect traps that we kind of repurposed for our intentions. We would essentially just put them over a patch of turtlehead, and then we grouped several caterpillars into each one, depending on what we felt like could support like how large the patches were. And then we would put the I think we had maybe 8 at max per dorm. And then of course those dorms would be surrounded by that wire that you saw to keep the entire thing protected from deer. And then we would just let them go through their natural thing. I would come through every day and count to make sure that we had the same amount of caterpillars within the dorm that we started with, because even though they were protected from the outside elements like birds and that sort of thing, we still did have the risk of potentially a caterpillar could maybe wiggle its way underneath, or maybe a spider could get in. There's any number of different things. I would also attempt to try and weed it out. There's a few different things that could happen, but it ended up being a pretty good situation. They would attach themselves to the chrysalis would attach to the side, and it made for a really good way to observe them without getting too into their business. So we started with 36, we ended up with 31, which is a really good survival rate. And from that 31, we got 11 egg masses in the first year that we started this. So we were expecting a huge amount of return the following year, but we ended up not getting that. But the adults, before releasing them, as I mentioned before, we would mark them with gel pen. So those dots that you see on the adult in the one photo with the 4 blue dots, those are actually indicators that would separate each adult from the next. So each one got their own special marker. The gel pen did not hurt them. The process did not hurt them. So every time they would emerge, I would collect them, mark them with the gel pen, mark down what indicator I gave them, what code I gave them, and then they would be released. If I would see them in the wild again, I would take a photo and then I would mark what day I saw them and when, to kind of keep track of who was hanging around, what location on property, how many we retained, and for how long. As I said, after their diapause phase, we didn't have much at all on a return from those eggs. Only 7 caterpillars were found on property from those 11 egg masses. So you figure 250 on average eggs per clutch times 11, we only got 7 back. We tried to be as careful as possible with them. We went through the entire process again. But unfortunately we did not get any egg masses for this year or for last year. So we are unfortunately going to have to start from scratch. but you know, that's the nature of this entire process. And it is, you know, it's an ever evolving thing. And we are just like everyone else, we are still learning and trying to make this stick. I mean, that's the best way that I can put it. Scott, you have anything to add?
Yeah. No, thank you. Are we still came out on time?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we're fine. It's
Okay,
8 o'clock
cool.
now. If people need to leave, they can leave. You take as much time as you need.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, we'll wrap up fairly soon, but I want to make sure we get to the end of this, part where we can kind of talk.
I'm trying to keep it brief. Like,
oh, yeah, it's fine. Thank you. So our thought was, you know, we were obviously concerned when we had this kind of crash, but made us feel better about our population and worse about the species as a whole. So it's good and bad, but what we noted on our property was pretty consistent what was noted around the state. So we were at several other wetlands where checker spots had been seen and thought to be very numerous in previous years, and this past year we noted the same thing. They weren't there. So they do have these crash years, and if it's hard to remember because our weather has been such a roller coaster the past few years, but we had an extremely hot summer. We had a pretty cold winter that year, and then it got warm fairly early and got pretty hot, and then we had a freeze in May, like a very unusual drop below freezing in May. So, you know, there's a lot of things that could have happened in all that time where things could have started moving. This species hangs out like in the leaf litter during the winter, during the diapause that Madison mentioned. So, you know, if the caterpillars start becoming active and then they freeze, they think they can start eating, the turtle head's popping up, then you get a freeze during that critical period. That can really hurt the species. So, but that doesn't mean that they're just going to be completely wiped out. The idea, and at least historically what would happen, is you would have more that maybe survive. There'd be a little different ecosystem they'd live in. Maybe there would just be so many of them in another population that there would be enough that would survive. Instead of 7, maybe there'd be 50, and then there'd be a few more eggs, and then those would recolonize some other places nearby. And then there'd be so many butterflies that when they'd have these crash years, they could backfill the sites that did get wiped out. The problem we have now is there's so few of these butterflies out across the landscape, and the remaining populations are so fragmented and isolated. They're all these little island populations. So if they blink out, there's nothing there to backfill them. And as we said earlier, they don't migrate. They stay within, what was the furthest? It's like a mile, but most of them stay within like a half mile. You know, it really depends on the landscape. If there's hills, if there's forests, if there, you know, how the landscape looks. But if it's open, they can travel, I think, a mile or two at most during that 2 weeks.
What did they say? It was like a square, like they use like a hectare, but it's like, that's it. Like it's nothing.
It's very, very limited. So if they leave our site, for instance, we do have another site nearby that they can use and they have been found on. So we're trying to create a meta population so that our 2 sites can backfill each other. That's our intent, is not just to create an island. We want to create a meta population, several small populations that can help each other and backfeed each other. That's our intent. And but other sites, it's just one. So if they have a bad year, that might be the last year. And that's kind of what happened at Harford Glen. They had several really good years. They were doing a lot of education around the species, and then they just kind of had a crash, and then it was kind of like they didn't bring any more in, and then that was it. You know, so we do feel like we want to have a couple good years to allow this population to be self-sustaining. If we just did 1 year and it crashed, you know, we're not going to give up after one bad year. We might have to kind of kickstart it a couple times before it really takes hold, is what we believe. But you know, that's kind of what time will tell. Something we did add this past year, previous year, was a nice fully enclosed enclosure that our friends of the Girl Scouts, Haley, led this project and built this for us. It's now full of turtlehead in this enclosure and airwood viburnum. So we have this fully enclosed place where we can keep the wasps out, any other potential predators, and then use this as a control. We could do things to this enclosure. We could shade it. If we want to be have a little less sun exposure, the screen does some shading on its own. So compare this one to a full sun exposure set of eggs and caterpillars that maybe was naturally laid by a free flying caterpillar. So that gives us a little bit more flexibility to kind of experiment a little bit more in a more controlled fashion than we did the first year. And I guess this is kind of where we're at now. And this is kind of our last slide for the project. And because of this climate issue that we're appear to be dealing with, as well as what we noted was all of our female butterflies selected for full sun, correct, Madison, for egg laying. So if you think about the species being more of a New England more cold tolerant Great Lakes species, the species is fairly common in like some of the bogs in Minnesota where it's really cold. It's a very short warm period up there. So if you think about the species in that way, they're going to select for the most sun they can get when they're finding plants to lay their eggs. Here at the southern edge of their population on the fringe, a few degrees temperature rise in different years could be enough that if they're selecting full sun, that and have a really hot summer, they could be getting cooked. They could go, they could web earlier than they need to. Typically, they can get too hot. There's a lot of things. It could be, you have droughts. There's all these things that they're, by selecting those types of places, could actually imperil them more in this part of the landscape than others. So we do want to do some sort of controlled experiment where maybe we shade half of the nests or move some eggs into more of our more shaded turtle head patches and see if there's a difference, see if there's a survival difference. We're going to count the caterpillars, see if there's a die-off in one that is more direct sun versus one that's more shaded, and see if that makes a difference. Now, would that help the long-term survivability of the species? Absolutely not, because we can't go out and shade all the all the caterpillars across Maryland. But yeah, that's our goal. That's our next goal. But
yeah, our goal. Umbrellas.
But if we know that's what's doing it and that's the reason, then we can say, okay, well then we're going to give up on places where it's just too hot for them. It's not worth doing this. Or we maintain some small populations where we do manage them. That way, there's something to be said for obviously zoos and aquariums, or sites like ours where maybe we have a sustainable population that we have to directly manage, but that allows people to get to know the species and see it and learn to love it and care about it. Now, does that help the species long term? It may, in the sense of advocacy, but if it can't survive on its own, there's a lot of people would say then it's not worth to keep spending time and money to maintain them at that level. So that's one of the big questions of conservation, I guess. So kind of a broader question for another day. But in the meantime, this is very preliminary. We obviously have an extremely small sample size. So everything we're talking about now is very much theory and things that we're predicting and we're going to experiment with. We cannot make any sort of determinations from these very, very, very small population of butterflies. But correlating it with some of the other things we're seeing, some of the maps, some of the things going on in the landscape as a whole, how they're doing further north, and all these things, we can compile all these things together and make some, fairly confident assumptions, I think, as time goes on. But, kind of as we say, will the Maryland state insect persist in the future at, where it actually lives in the state where it's our state insect? That's kind of something, and hopefully in our lifetime, will be the answer will be yes, not no, but time will tell. Did you have any other points in that, Madison?
No, I think you pretty much covered it.
So just some other quick roundup at the end here, and then we'll take any other questions you have. So we have some cool merch, including some cool Checkerspot merch. We have shirts and bags and all that kind of cool stuff. Support our local wildlife and our state insect. And we also have one with the zebra swallowtail and the pawpaw. We're very big on that. These are just some of our events coming up as well. And we do a big pawpaw celebration in the fall with ice cream and beer and lemonade and all kinds of cool products for pawpaws and paddling. And we do a bluebell hike in the spring and a vernal pool hike in firefly hike. So, obviously go to the Natural History Society events and attend all their meetings. If there's time in between those, come join us for some cool stuff too, and check out some of the landscape up where we're doing our work, and mostly Harford County. And then here's all of our kind of social media stuff. Follow us and learn more about what we do. And hopefully our wildlife center opens this summer, and that's our plan we're working towards. So you can come check that out and learn more about the species up close and personal. And yeah, let us know any other questions you got. We'll give a couple minutes here if anyone can think of anything that we didn't cover. Our pleasure. We thank everybody for taking time out to learn about.
Thank you guys for coming. Yeah.
That was so interesting, and this is such important work. Can't thank you enough. And thank you for coming and sharing your expertise with us.
Yeah, it's always our pleasure. We love partnering with you all, and we really have a shared mission. So we really are happy to be a part of anything you're all doing. And and if anyone has questions later on you think of, or anything that we talked about that comes up later, or you're trying to plan something in your own yard, give us a shout. Our email's on there. We'll do our best to answer it. And at the very least, we can connect the dots for you and try to give you some insight on what we've learned. We're always learning every day, and that's how we always want to be. But we've learned a ton about the species we never thought would have been possible when we started this. So it's been really interesting. And that's the thing. You don't know until you do it. And the state had to move on to some other species that were more imperiled, and they kind of figured out what the species was doing and what it wasn't doing. And they kind of said, hey, we had our funds had to direct us somewhere else. And we said, hey, we'll pick up the mantle on this and try another go at it, since we had the property and the plants and the will, and Madison had the enthusiasm and energy to put into working on the species and giving it some extra care. So we're not giving up on it anytime soon, that's for sure. We'll see if we can do anything we can to protect the species into the future.
Look forward to hearing more about the progress that you're making. Thanks so much. Last call for questions, anybody?
I think Fred has one. I could be wrong.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks for the nice presentation, and appreciate the work you guys are doing to make this insect survive as best as possible. I think the question I was going to ask was kind of already answered, because you mentioned about the state money having been directed somewhere else, right? So I was just curious about, how much the state had invested in this, and being that that's the state insect, you would think maybe there would be a stronger effort on the part of the state. But if they had a go at it already, is what you were saying, I think, a few minutes ago.
Yeah, I mean, when I got involved with DNR's work on this, I mean, they've been working on the species for, I want to say, a decade. I mean, we had Tufts University coming down, doing a bunch of research for some years. We're very late to the game. So they've done a lot of, most of the things we knew and we were able to do to set up our product was all because of the work that had been laid out before us by a lot of other folks. Spent a lot of time in these wetlands and trying out a lot of things. So that's kind of why there was a step back of the species, mostly because there's only so much you can do. You can only cage so many sets of turtlehead, right? And you can't do anything really about the climate. So when climate was saw to be probably a larger contributing factor to the range shifting further north and to the higher elevations, so these populations will be monitored, I'm sure, by the state into the long term. But I think the goal now, and I'm speaking from what I remember, I may be inaccurate. I don't want to speak for DNR. But my understanding was they were kind of looking at wetland butterflies as a whole now, not just this one species, because if you have these wetland systems, you have other species of wetland butterflies that are going to benefit from having these wetlands protected, maintained, kept open and sunny, things like that. So I think it was more of just, there's only so many people out there, so only so many biologists to do the work. So I think the idea was, hey, let's focus on wetland butterflies as a whole. And the state honestly has to a lot of times follow funding. If they have federal money that says they have to do reports about wetland butterflies and certain species and Puritan tiger beetles or whatever it might be, they have to follow, some of those directives too. So I don't want to make it sound like they weren't doing work for the species. They certainly were. But there's really only so much you can do. Now, our property is state property, so we're doing this work in partnership with them on a state-owned piece of property. So this is kind of, a new experiment to see what we can learn from it at this level. And then we'll keep advising the state. And if there's more that can be done in other populations, hopefully, we can advise that, and maybe some more work can be done across the landscape to benefit the species.
Okay,
And our
great.
research
you.
here has also gone to not that I'm saying that this is even really going to do anything, but it has the data that we have collected so far has gone to the federal level, and has been cataloged at National Fish and Game. So they do have it, and it is going to a larger scale than just Maryland. Like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean that, they're going to come down and suddenly start, giving us a bunch of funding and stuff, but it is that the data is going outside of the state and is actually contributing further than the scope of just the state. And we hope that that continues into the future.
Yeah, in the future of climate change, it's going to be very different across the conservation landscape, because we have to decide: are we going to focus on species that are at the edges, that are we can't just fix that problem. It's a very big problem, as many of you may have heard once or twice. Funding and effort should be put into populations that can be saved. If it's a climate fueled decline, there's not much we're gonna be able to do. So there's gonna be a lot of decisions that have to be made in the future of what species to focus on. Now, that's not saying as species as a whole. That's just in Maryland. If they're thriving in Massachusetts and northern Pennsylvania and Appalachia, then the species are doing okay. There's not doing okay here, and that's happened throughout history. So species ranges have changed dramatically before and after ice ages and other things. So obviously it's happening at a faster pace now, but hopefully they find places that they can persist into the future, and we can continue to monitor them best we can.
We're in a time of transition, and we need to focus on the things that we can do and make the most of those. And we all have to work together. I appreciate you guys so much.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all
All right,
for your
thanks.
interest. Have a great night,
Take care,
everybody.
everyone.
Have a great
Thank
night,
you.
everybody.
Enjoy